Deer Camp, written by the 111112. In 2015, I made my dream purchase. 200 acres of fields and forest for deer hunting. The property had been abandoned by the previous owners, and I was the lucky one to benefit when the bank wanted it off their hands. I made the 6-hour drive to the property the instant that I had the key to the gate. I was so excited. I arrived at the gate and noticed that the gate and the dirt road leading onto the property were looking pretty overgrown. Grass covered most of the road and thickets of all kinds grew over the gate. I cleared away what I needed to and opened the gate. I drove about half a mile down the dirt road and ended up at a little cabin. I threw the truck into park and I hopped out. It was quiet, really quiet. Almost too quiet. I heard the dash of one chipmunk along the ground, and that was it. I stood still for a second to see if it was me that everything was reacting to. It felt like the woods was holding its breath, and me along with it. After a minute of not moving and almost holding my breath, some birds started to chirp again, and things felt more normal. I walked to the small cabin. Right inside were hooks to hang deer from once they were gutted. The inside was small. The whole thing was one room. It had 2 old bunk beds, a wood stove, a homemade sink set up to use a 5-gallon water tank right next to it, and a small table with 4 chairs around it. It was perfect. I left the cabin and walked around the area a little more and found an outhouse nearby. After about an hour-long walk, I found plenty of signs of deer. I also stumbled into a type of track that I didn't recognize. It looked old, and the weather had taken its toll on it. It was about the length of my boot, but it had 4 toes, or what looked like toes, that split out from it about halfway down. It looked like deep claws tipped each toe. When I knelt down to look closer at it, it felt like I had eyes on my back. I whipped around, but there was nothing anywhere around me, just me. I chucked up the trail to an old spot that a turkey may have scratched up looking for food, and the weather had probably done the rest. It quickly left my mind. I left the property, excited for deer season. The 4 of us arrive the day before the season begins. The property looked very different with the change of season. There were no more leaves on the trees, and a light coat of frost covered much of the ground when we pulled up to the cabin. We brought our stuff in and we talked about where we were going to go the next morning. We made our plan, played some cards, had a few beans over the stove, and then went to bed. The next morning, I made it to my spot and settled into my ground blind. It was all enclosed and had 3 small windows in it. 1 out the front and 1 out each side. I didn't see a single thing the entire morning. And then I turned my head to the noise and also saw something dart up from the field that I had been looking over all morning. I quickly tried to look through my scope to see what it was. All that I saw was a dark mass take off. But it was running to the noise, not away from it. I got out of the blind and headed that way too. It turns out that one of my buddies got a nice buck. He gutted it and we hung it in front of the cabin. We were all so excited. The new property has already paid off. The next morning we went back to our spots. My buddy who got the deer only had 1 tag, so he headed out just to see what he would see. He left his gun at the cabin. It was still dark when I got into my blind. I glanced out the front window and I did a double take. Out in the field in front of me were 2 solid, blood-red eyes. It was too dark to make out what they belonged to, but they froze me in my seat. I could tell that they saw right through my blind and were looking right at me. We held each other's stare for what felt like forever. Just as it was starting to get light out, the figure bolted, sprinting faster than anything I had ever seen, right back in the direction of yesterday's thing. A few seconds later, I heard a scream. I jumped from my blind and I sprinted to the sound. I found my friend who had gotten the deer yesterday, shaking on the ground, clinging to 3 deep gashes on his side. Our other 2 friends showed up a second later. We carefully picked him up and rushed back to the cabin. When we got there, we all froze and went pale. The deer was gone. Tracks matching the one that I had seen that summer were everywhere. The cabin was covered in claw marks and blood. The only window was smashed. And carved on the front of the cabin and stained in blood was a message. "These are my woods. Leave now." It was clearly done with ease by massive claws. We left, leaving lots behind. Our friend didn't make it to the hospital. I've never gone back, and I never will. Never go to an estate sale. Written by Vladimir Putin A. Cup. About 6 months or so ago, I was at an estate sale. I pulled up to an old house which had Victorian-age architecture. I got out of my car and a man came up to me. "Hi, my name's Jeff. Feel free to walk around. Only the shed is off limits. That's where the previous owners died. It's a shame the way they died, but we're auctioning off everything tomorrow, so today's the last day," Jeff said. "Thanks," I said. "Hopefully I can find some treasures." He didn't look amused. I walked up to the front door and pulled it open. It creaked on its hinges. I took a step into the kitchen. There were dishes and china strewn all over the place. Knives and cooking utensils lined the counters. I looked out the kitchen window and I saw that Jeff was watching me next to an old shed with a rusted roof. I quickly looked away and continued looking around the old dusty house. I walked out of the kitchen, past the dining room, until I made it to what was left of the living room. The thick blinds on the windows did not let in any sunlight, and the curtains covered some broken glass on the ground from the window behind it. Only a few lamps illuminated the room. The wall where a TV was supposed to be had a blast mark. I shuddered as to what might have happened to the last family that lived here. I hurriedly began to rummage around through the old boxes, and I looked around and I came upon an old antique jukebox. It had some damage, but overall it was in pretty good shape. There weren't any records except for one, which was an unmarked gray record. I asked Jeff how much the jukebox cost. He looked at it with a glassy look in his eyes. $10, I want it out of my hands," he said. I looked at him confused. I shrugged my shoulders and I thought nothing about it, and then I paid and took the jukebox back home. I found a spot next to the TV stand to set it up. The jukebox was big and wide, so I moved around it, looking for the wire to plug it into the outlet. I kept searching, but to no avail. Frustrated, I called Jeff. "It's me," I said. "What's up, Colin?" he said. "I have a few questions about the jukebox," I told him. "What kind of questions?" he asked with a hint of hesitation. Where's the plug for the jukebox?" There was silence. "Jeff?" I asked. He hung up. I tried calling the number again. An automatic message came up, saying, "You've been blocked by the user." I gave up getting answers and decided to sleep on it. I woke up later in the middle of the night, around 3 a.m., to the sound of an old 1980s rock song that you would hear in the local diner. It was playing out of a staticky sounding system. I grabbed a flashlight and I went downstairs to investigate. There was the jukebox. It was fully functional. The neon lights were on and flickering. Then the record scratched and the needle lifted and the records started shuffling. They ended settling on the gray record. It started to spin and a raspy voice of an old man started playing. "I've been living here for so many years now that the kids are gone. Jeff visits from time to time. The man with the sacked head seems to have stopped following me ever since I took the records out.
He's been terrorizing my family since I got that cursed jukebox. I hope that the next owner of the jukebox tries to destroy the thing. I haven't been able to sleep for several months now. I think I'm just going to sleep.
The record cuts. The jukebox turns off, and I walk outside. Tonight the moon was full and the skies were clear, and across the street there was a figure, wearing chains, and he had a sack on his head. I ran back into the house and I locked the doors. I took the record out and I dragged the jukebox into my basement. Then I broke the record over my knee and I set fire to the jukebox. I had a fire extinguisher in case the fire got out of control. After the fire was out, I ran back upstairs. Then I opened the blinds to the front of my house. The man wasn't there anymore. I think to myself that it's all probably just a coincidence. That whoever he is, he probably won't be back again. I go back down to the basement. All that remains are the burnt crisps of the jukebox. I went back to my bedroom to try to get some shut-eye. And just as I start to fall asleep, the familiar sound of 1980s diner music starts to play. Night Driving, written by D. Gill, 517. I live in a small town in the Northeast, with a lot of forests and barely anything to do for fun. So, being 16 at the time, a few friends and I decided to meet at one of our houses and see what kind of trouble we could cause. I picked up my friend Jackson, who lives about 20 minutes away, and we went to meet up with our other two friends, Steven and Max, who were already playing pool by the time that I picked up Jackson. It wasn't too late, maybe 7 o'clock, and summertime, so the sun was just setting and you could almost make out the purple and creamsicle hue of the sky through the trees. I got to a T-stop and waited for a car to pass and then crept out past this shack that always rubbed me the wrong way. It wasn't nefarious, I hadn't seen ghosts, but it was a little wood lean-to basically entrenched in old boxes, antique signs, and other stuff that American pickers would have a field day with. As far as I had ever seen, the only person going in and out was this lanky man with a gray beard down to about his collarbone. He always had on a blue jacket and jeans. I saw him walking and I gave him a wave as he looked down and I passed by. I pulled up to Jackson's house, honked the horn, and queued up some Queen. I saw Jackson's gangly form moving from his garage, naturally looking like his joints were put together backwards. He got in and we made our way to Steven's. We pulled up to the house after about another 20-minute drive. We let ourselves in, weaving our way down to Steven's basement where he and Max had been shooting pool. And so went our night. We played pool, rode around in Steven's rusty little truck looking for something to do, and we tried to sneak up to his neighbors' houses to scare them. It wasn't exactly dazed and confused. At around 11:30, I tapped Jackson's shoulder. "We should probably head out. My curfew is at midnight and I'm absolutely going to miss that," I said. He nodded. He was also past curfew. He held up his hand as Max offered him the pool cue and announced, "All right, guys, I think Drew and I have to head out. We have to both be home by now." Steven thanked us for coming and Max made his way out alongside us, deciding that being the last guest would likely lead to sitting with Steven 3 hours later and listening to him describe the woes of finding love, or at least sex, in such a small town. We headed up the drive, said our goodbyes, and started down the hill from Steven's driveway. About 15 minutes later, the conversation between me and Jackson had stagnated. We were tired and talking about the Red Sox pitching woes could only carry us so far. As we went up a bit of an incline, approaching that cabin, we saw the old man's blue rain jacket and jeans in my headlights. He was walking along the side of the road. His hands were crammed into his pockets and his head was watching his feet shuffle forward. "Jackson, what's that guy doing?" I asked. Given that he has a simple sense of humor, he laughed and made some joke about him being a serial killer. I can't remember the details of it, but I do know that I laughed too. As we were getting closer to him, I saw the man start to tilt his head up. His beard peeked out from behind the brim of his beat-up green cap. And then we saw his face, or lack thereof. It was so jarring to me, just a blank space, illuminated by headlights as we breezed past him. I felt my hands begin to tremble on the steering wheel. Did he have a face?" I asked. Jackson's head slowly tilted towards me. I wasn't looking. My gaze was locked on the road out of what I could only guess was fear. But out of the corner of my eye, I could see that he was flush. His mouth was hanging open as I heard him eke out what could barely count as a response. "He didn't have a face." He slowly turned away from me, and those last 5 minutes were somehow even more quiet. Or maybe it was just more noticeable. It felt like routine, pulling into his driveway, dropping him off without a word, and leaving. I didn't drive back that way, opting to throw my curfew to the wind and go the long way home, adding easily another half an hour. I didn't care. I was not going back that way. When I drive by that cabin in the day, I can very rarely hear a gunshot ring out. Set way back on that thing's property, I don't see it walking down the road anymore. A trip with friends that will forever haunt me. Written by Rogue AC. It all started with me deciding what to do over the summer. I didn't care how I spent it as long as it was memorable with people that I care about. 2 weeks into summer, my best friend Stacy suggested that our friend group should go on a camping trip, since none of us have ever done anything like that before. I agreed, and so did everyone else. We all had a week to prepare and get everything that we would need for a 3-day trip. The people that were going were my good friends, Stacy, Jack, Patrick, Alyssa, and my crush, Emily. I packed a big tent that would fit 3 people, some extra food, a lot of water, a machete, just in case, and a small paintball gun in case there's any wildlife that could disrupt our trip and potentially harm us. The night before my trip, my friends all showed up at my house and said that they wanted to catch the sunrise as we drove up to our camping spot. Being a little weirded out, I nodded and got ready. Before I left, I was heading back to tell my mom that I would be out for a while, and my friend Jack said he already told my mom and that she said to have fun. The trip up was normal, although mostly silent since a lot of us were pretty exhausted by the fact that it was still nighttime. We arrived at the spot and we were able to admire the sunrise. I checked my phone and saw that I had no reception. I just shrugged it off since we were in the middle of the woods. I told some jokes and we set out to do our things like have a small snack and then enjoy the day in the woods. Night 1. By the time it was night, we all went to the campfire that Patrick had set up and we were telling ghost stories. I spotted Emily sneaking glances at me. And she was maybe blushing, I couldn't tell. But I didn't try to think much of it. By the time it was time to sleep, I heard someone unzipping my tent and I looked up to see Emily. She was in baggy PJs that showed a lot of cleavage, since her top wasn't buttoned up correctly. She wanted to sleep in my tent since the tent that she was sleeping in, it was with Stacy, wasn't all that good because of Stacy's snoring. Me being the love-crazed guy that I am, I let her sleep next to me, but at a good distance so I wouldn't accidentally poke her. She backed up to me though when we were spooning. I tried to slowly back away, but she got my arm and wrapped it around her. She said that she didn't mind it and that it was okay if it were just me. I was mainly nervous because she shoved my hand right up against her chest. And she had always been such a modest girl who was always shy about physical contact. The rest of the night was normal, but very distantly I heard a high-pitched noise. It was unclear what it was since there were night animals making louder noises, such as owls, and what I think was a deer. I woke up to my hand inside of her shirt, and this made me freak out for 2 reasons. 1, because Emily wasn't awake, and 2, that I might have accidentally moved my hand there in my sleep. I slowly moved so that she wouldn't wake up, but she did, and she laughed it off, saying that it was an honest mistake. I was weirded out by how she normally doesn't act this way. So I didn't really question it, I just got up and got ready for the day. My friends decided to hike and I joined them. The morning got from okay to weird since all of my friends were acting, well, weird. And what I mean was that all of their personalities seemed bland and not their own. Stacy, who had a fear of snakes, walked in the tall grass, where it was most likely that snakes would be. Patrick, who was a constant show-off, wasn't showing off. Instead, he was looking around for something, I don't know what for. And what I found most weird was Alyssa and Jack, and how they were normally the most chattiest in the group and were now dead silent, and didn't say a word to anyone or to each other. They just walked together in silence. Emily was being really clingy to me, which I questioned. The sun soon set and I decided to head back to my tent early and relax. About an hour later, Jack walked in and asked if everything was okay. I told him that everything was fine, I was just feeling a little bit drained from the hike. I then asked Jack if he thinks that anyone else is acting suspicious. He looks at me and smiles, but I feel this sinister aura about him. He continues smiling innocently, and his pupils now seem a little too big to be normal, since there's still quite a bit of sunlight outside. Nope, everybody seems to be acting normal, although Emily does seem to be really into you, he said. I tried not to act weird, and I ended the conversation shortly after that. I told him that I wanted to get to sleep a little early. He soon left the tent, and everyone gathered around the campfire, and I laid there pretending that I was asleep. They were all talking normally, and I soon began to doze off when I saw all of their heads turn towards me. The heads tilted so unnaturally that it shook me awake. I blink, and they're all back to normal, and they're saying that they're turning in. Night 2. I can't sleep. I didn't want to after what I had witnessed. Emily walks in again, saying that she can't sleep, and she asked if she could sleep in here again. I was a bit freaked out and I didn't say anything, but I did nod. She bites her lip and she looks at me. She leans into my ear and says that she's always wanted me, and begins to undo her top. I stop her since that isn't how I want to picture Emily. I tell her that I'm not interested in her like that and that I want to see her as a friend. She nods and then lays down to sleep. Hours go on and I fight the urge to fall asleep. Rubbing my eyes, I decided to open the tent and to let some of the breeze in. And when I do, I see everyone's shadow from their tents. They aren't laying down. They're all straight up and staring at me. I slowly move my hand to re-zip the tent flap, and I look back at Emily, who is asleep. But she's making a sound that it's something no human can make. These aren't my friends that I'm with. Thinking quickly, I unzip the back of my tent that faces away from the camp, and I grab my machete just in case. I get my bag that contains my keys and phone. I sneak out and very slowly walk backwards away from the camp. I turn and run when I know that I'm far enough away. A little later, The loudest shriek that I've ever heard rips around me, echoing in the woods. Suddenly, I hear footsteps approaching me and I hide in the side of a log. The footsteps get louder and louder. What must have been a few minutes felt like an eternity, and the footsteps soon dash back the way that they had come. After a few more minutes, I book it to my car. The sun finally rises just as I reach my car. I hop in and I turn the ignition. I press the gas and begin backing out of the parking space. As I look back, I see the faces of my friends, except it's not them. They're attached to these skinny creatures that tilt their heads viciously and point at me. I sped all the way home. My phone buzzed so many times, and when I reached the second gas station, I checked it. There were so many texts from everyone and missed calls from my mom. I found out that I had been reported missing and that my friends had all texted me where I was. The most shocking thing was that there was a recent text from an unknown number saying, "We'll get you next time." I don't know who or what they are, but this made me make a code word with my friends to make sure that they are, in fact, who they say they are. I never found out what those things were and what they wanted, but I know that if I had fallen asleep, well, I wouldn't have made it back. I got sick after I stopped working at the hospital. Written by SirRonnoc. For my entire life, I have essentially lived at the hospital. Both my mother and father were nurses at the hospital in my hometown in Maine, and so I spent much of my childhood in the hospital nursery and the youth center. I always wanted to become a nurse like my mother and father, and so after high school, I went straight into nursing school. After 3 years in college and working in the hospitals on the weekends, I was able to get a full-time job at a hospital in a town near where I grew up. I absolutely loved my job. I always felt full of life and energy when I was helping people, and I loved to spend time with the patients. One of the things that I spent time doing was cheering up patients that were gravely ill, the ones that sadly lacked close family or friends who would be there by their sides through their ordeal. I would spend hours talking to them about their lives and memories, doing my very best to make their last few days comfortable and cheery. To most people, it would have been very depressing, but I could go home at the end of the day knowing that I made a difference in a life of at least one person, and that made me very happy. However, about a year ago, I started to feel like there was something missing in my life. Despite having a very happy job and off-and-on relationships with people in town, I couldn't help but feel that there was something that I needed to be doing. After talking about it with my parents, who had retired from their nursing duties, I decided to take a year-long series of trips around the world. I had never been much further than the next state over, and I kept hearing from colleagues and friends that travel could really help me to broaden my horizons, that it would add to my life. And so off I went. I traveled around the world, backpacking through Europe and going on safaris in Africa. However, when I was visiting Tokyo, Japan, I began to feel very ill. I could barely get out of bed in the morning, and everything felt like it took far more effort than it actually did. One day, I collapsed on the floor of my hotel and managed to call the Japanese emergency services for help. When I got to the hospital, everything happened at about the same way that it did in hospitals back home. The doctors admitted me, fed me IV fluids, and ran many tests to try to figure out what had caused this problem. They found nothing wrong. And after a few days, I was feeling fully better and was discharged with instructions to eat a more balanced diet. About 2 weeks later, I was vacationing in Spain and I had another serious bout of exhaustion. I felt absolutely awful. And so I went to the nearest hospital as I did not want a repeat of what happened last time. Once again, they dismissed it as simply a nutritional problem and they discharged me. However, The strange thing was that mere hours after arriving at the hospital, I began to feel remarkably better. Even before I finished waiting in line at the non-emergency clinic to receive care. This became a pattern in my life. I would be traveling, and every so often I would feel this extreme exhaustion and have to go to the hospital. As with the first two cases, whenever I spent time in the hospital, I would remarkably get better. But it slowly worsened, and soon enough I was having to go to the hospital at least twice a week. I was getting annoyed because of it and slowly started to lose that shine and energy that I had once had. I would snap at random people in the street and began to hate everyone around me. People that felt so happy and energetic all the time. 3 days before I was due to board a flight back to Maine, I was walking down a street in Salvador, Brazil, towards the local hospital for one of my visits, and I saw an elderly lady crossing the road. It was one of those streets without proper crosswalks, with just a yield sign for pedestrians to warn cars to stop, and it was on a rather sharp corner. Suddenly, she stumbled and fell, and a city bus happened to be taking the corner at high speeds. The driver didn't see her until the last minute, and the bus came to a sudden stop on top of her frail body. When I saw this, I should have been horrified just like any of the other pedestrians and passers-by. However, I felt a sudden, inexplicable burst of excitement and energy. I felt like I had suddenly been revitalized completely, and all of the exhaustion that I had been feeling just moments before vanished in an instant. I didn't even feel bad for her. All of this exhaustion and pain that I had been feeling being lifted dissipated any feelings of horror or sadness that I might have felt. I ran away from the accident like many others did, but for me it was not an escape from the horrible sight, but a way to release some energy that I had just received. Over the next 3 days, I decided to take some walks through the bad neighborhoods in Salvador. I don't know why I did this. I think it was more instinctual than anything. Despite all the drug deals, gang fights, and homeless people that I walked by, I continually felt energized and happy. However, my big realization happened when I saw a gang member pull out a gun and shoot another man in an alleyway. Energy shot through my entire body, just like it had when the old woman had been hit by the bus. I almost laughed. I have spent almost my entire life in hospitals. I practically lived in them as a child, and I was constantly in and out of hospitals throughout high school and college, until I felt the need to travel the world. My entire life was constantly, undoubtedly surrounded by the despair and death of others. Thinking back on it now, I always felt my very best after I helped a child through a painful injury, or after sitting beside the bedside of a dying patient. Once I got home, I got my old job as a nurse back, and I worked long hours at the hospital every day. However, nothing ever felt the same. I didn't get the same satisfaction out of helping patients through their pain, as I myself longed for it. I couldn't give a dying patient comfort, as I craved their inevitable end. The last few weeks, I've begun forgetting to bring patients their necessary medication or hooking up the wrong IV bag to a transplant patient. However, even these things aren't enough. I need more, and I am going to get it. There is something out there, lurking in the Pacific Ocean. Written by ATTE212. The ocean is a vast, mysterious place. Only 5% of it has ever been explored, and we know more about what's in space than what lies beneath the waves. I live in Niihau, Hawaii, and spend a lot of my time scuba diving in the open ocean. I do research there and use hydrophones to record whale calls or underwater volcanic activity. Sometimes I would encounter whales or even great whites while diving. Other times I would be alone in the deep blue. I always liked the feeling of mystery and isolation beneath the waves. But then, everything changed. One afternoon, I was on my boat with a friend of mine named Kevin, listening to the underwater recordings that my hydrophones had picked up. And I heard a very strange sound that sounded similar to the bloop. "What could it be? A blue whale?" Kevin asked. "I'm not sure. It sounded much louder than a blue whale." "Whatever it was may be even larger than a blue whale," I said. Kevin was astonished. "What are we waiting for? This could be the discovery of the century," he said. It may have seemed a bit reckless, but whatever it was somewhere beneath us. So we suited up and we took a dive. Usually, when you look down in the open ocean, you will see nothing but blue darkness. But the area below us was a murky, jet black. That made Kevin and I nervous, because the weather that day was clear and sunny. Kevin had an underwater camera with him. As we continued to dive down, suddenly, we bumped into a large, unknown mass. Whatever it was very sticky. Luckily, I had a knife with me, so I used it to free myself and Kevin. As I cut through the mass, a mysterious gray fluid oozed out and sank deep into the ocean, as if it were oil. I was able to free myself and Kevin, and we swam to the surface as fast as we could. As we escaped and looked down, I saw a huge, round head, shaped like a blob with red eyes. As soon as I saw those gigantic eyes, I swam even faster. I could only hear three things: my heart pounding, water rushing as we swam frantically, and a very loud, low-pitched howling noise coming from beneath us. Although it took us a few minutes to get back to our boat, it felt like several hours. Kevin lost his camera on our way back to the boat. As he got on the boat, I looked down one last time. I saw tons of fish as well as a fin whale, caught and being pulled right into the large black mass. Kevin and I immediately got out of there and made it to the safety of land. "That was a close one," Kevin said as he laughed. I laughed with him, and we later went to a restaurant together for lunch. "What was that thing?" he asked over lunch. Of all the years studying marine life in the area, I've never seen anything like it. I saw lots of other sea creatures, including a fin whale, stuck to the mass, and they were being pulled into it. This is most likely how the creature eats. And using the whale to get a sense of scale, the creature must have been at least 400 feet long, I said. "Well, it looks like I won't be going out to the open ocean ever again," said Kevin. After lunch, I drove to my house to relax. A few weeks later, I saw a news report on TV. Apparently, a U.S. naval submarine went missing off the coast of Oahu, and the last thing they heard from the crew was that they had collided with a sticky black mass.
I Found Something in My Woods. Written by Crimson Prism. I've always been a huge fan of horror. John Carpenter, Ridley Scott, the greats, and all their films. I know weird when I see it, and I know unusual things are happening. I just want to let you all know that before I get into this. This happened last summer, and it's been trickling in every once in a while since then. It was mid-August in southern Ohio. Muggy as hell,
and around 90 degrees. I was living with my mom and her boyfriend at the time in a cabin that had little air conditioning. It had one of those window ones that was probably 20 years old, and it just pushed the air around inside really without actually cooling it. I had a room on the second floor. It was the only room up some stairs aside from a half bath. I really did love it in there. There was a skylight and a straight eye line up through the trees where you could see every single star. Not many other people lived around here aside from an old guy about a half a mile down the road. And I don't even know if he had electricity, so there wasn't really any light pollution. The old guy was always sitting out on his front porch, staring into the woods. Kind of a weird dude, but he never hurt anyone. Sometimes he'd wave as we came down the driveway, still just staring off into the woods. One morning, I was asked to go cut a small tree down for some firewood. It was down by the lake nearby, maybe a half a mile hike from the cabin. I agreed. I'm living here rent-free, so I went and I got the axe and I headed that way. I remember that it was a really nice morning, but it was heating up quickly. I decided to hike for a bit and then head to the lake. Once I got there, I realized that something was off. Everything was quiet. Not the nice morning in the woods type of quiet. No, it was unnatural. The trees weren't moving. The lake had no wake. There were no birds chirping. Chills ran up my spine, and I had the worst goosebumps I've ever had. I scanned the lake's edges around the trees for something. A bear? No, around here we don't really have bears large enough to scare other animals into being this quiet. I kept looking, scanning the tree line, when something caught my eye. It was as black as night and sitting near the lake's edge. Begrudgingly, I walked towards it. The thing was maybe 150 yards down the shore, and once I got closer to it, it resembled a cube, about the size of a soccer ball. The sense of dread that I felt being near this thing is like nothing that I've ever felt before. It felt like I had a bottomless pit in my stomach. I know that I shouldn't have done it, but I did because I honestly am not sure why, really. Anyway, I picked up the object and it was weightless. It was lighter than air, if that makes sense. As soon as I touched it, it was nothing in my hand. I looked around it and it seemed to just take in light from around it, as if eating it. That's when I heard a noise behind me in the woods. I still don't know how to describe it, and I'm the one that heard it. It couldn't have been more than a few feet off into the woods. I heard a clicking mixed with a very, very low rumble. It was almost like a subwoofer going off. I could feel it in my bones. It lasted for what felt like forever, but was seriously probably only about 15 seconds. As soon as it stopped, something in the object pinched my hand. It felt like a small needle prick. I dropped the cube and it fell like a 100-pound weight almost instantly. But it didn't make a dent on the ground. I looked at my hand and there was nothing that I could see. No blood, no marks, nothing. I looked back into the woods and I heard another few clicks, and then everything went back to normal. The trees moved, the lake waved, the birds started chirping again. I don't think that I've ever run faster in my life. I sped back to the cabin to find no one home. So I locked myself up in my room. I took my small trash can and I immediately began to throw up. I was sweating profusely, but for the first time in weeks, I was freezing. I crashed on the bed, and hours later, I woke up staring out the skylight. Freaked out, I sat up and listened. Nothing again. No clocks ticking, no wood floors creaking, no wind outside. I checked the clock in my room, and it showed 5:30 something. That couldn't be right, though. It was pitch black as I looked out the skylight and in the house. I couldn't see any lights coming from under my door. I went to unplug the clock and it stayed on. My head was spinning, trying to understand what was going on. I wanted to yell for my mom, but I couldn't. I knew not to. Something was watching me, but I couldn't tell from where. I grabbed a hunting knife and laid back down in my bed. Maybe I could sleep and it would go away, right? As I lay there, I heard it again. This time it started with a low rumble and then a whine. It sounded almost like a dolphin. It lasted for about a minute and then stopped. As soon as it stopped, I heard 3 distinct taps. 3 taps on the skylight and then a growl. I lost it. I screamed bloody murder and I ran out of my room. I ran down the stairs and outside straight to the truck. I started it up and I peeled out of the drive. As I passed the old man's house, I could tell that it was different. He was standing straight up, pointing out and staring out at the drive, and his gaze followed me as I passed. I must have driven for 2 hours before I realized that I didn't know where I was. I don't remember when it had gotten light out, but it was now 3 p.m. the next day, bright and sunny. I pulled over to a gas station and they allowed me to use one of their phones. I called back to the house and my mom was going insane. She was asking where I went and telling me that I scared them last night, that they almost called the cops to find me. Apparently, I had run into the house after the lake incident and started to have a seizure in the living room. And then I had suddenly stopped and walked calmly to my bedroom, laid down, and stared out my skylight for hours. They couldn't get me to respond. A few hours later, I screamed like an animal and ran out of the house, and, well, you know the rest. To this day, I can't explain it. It's been almost a year now, and I refuse to go back to that cabin or anywhere even around that area. I moved away to get rid of those memories. But I think whatever it was, well, it's followed me. I see those black cubes around sometimes. Once in a coffee shop, a few times just on the side of the road, and even once in my fridge. I haven't touched them. I know not to now. I do hear the sounds sometimes too. Mostly outside my house, never out and about. I've just started to keep my windows locked and nailed shut. I made the mistake, and I wish every single day that I hadn't. So please, if you see the cube, do not touch it. You may end up crazy and alone, like me. The Princeton Oil Leak, written by Happy Days Boy. When I was about 14 years old, I remember being at my parents' lake house, which was really in the middle of a forest. It was 2 a.m. My friend had been staying with us while we were there, and she suggested that we sneak out and go for a swim. The water was warm during the day. It had a perfect blue tint to it and was completely free of debris. During the night, we may have anticipated how good it would be. Oddly, though, the water felt thick, and it was murky, and my foot kept hitting fish. We were in the middle of the lake, floating on our backs. We were playing a game of who could get to the shore first with a backstroke. My arms treaded the water behind me as I did a backstroke. The moon was shining bright in my eyes, and there were a few bats fluttering across the sky. It was really a great night, minus the grimy water, of course. I got to the shore before my friend did. My arms reached the shore of the lake, and I pulled myself out. Now, the lake wasn't huge, but it wasn't small. It was quite long and wide, about the size of 3/4 of a soccer stadium. I stared at the water for a minute, seeing my friend getting nearer. She stopped herself before saying, "Oh, man." I'll race swim you to the other side." And then she started in the opposite direction. I laughed, feeling the lack of energy burning away at my muscles and joints. I headed into the water before seeing a line of people. On the other side of the lake, there was a line of people. There could have easily been about 60 of them, lining one side of the lake entirely. I looked back at my friend before screaming, "Get out!" She stopped and looked at me. I pointed, and she looked and saw the long line of people. With that, she began swimming towards me with a pretty decent speed. She shouted, "Don't leave me!" And I knew that it was best to obey. She stopped at the halfway point and peered back over to the line of people. A faint curse slipped out of her mouth. It was then that they started coming towards us. Half of them began getting into the water, and the other half began going around both sides of the lake. The size of these people was weird. Some were tall or fat, or thin and small. Some of them even looked like children. It was hard to see anything other than their silhouettes considering that it was dark. But before I could try and get a good enough glimpse of what they actually looked at, my friend stabbed her nails into my arm and gripped tight, running and then pulling me away. We ran to the lake house and stayed awake, staring outside. The people had returned to the original line, and when it began getting lighter, they disappeared into the shadows of the forest. Neither of us talked to anyone about this. We both knew that no one would believe us, so we kept silent about it for the remaining years of high school. That is, until now. You see, my parents gave us permission to stay at their lake house as we finished exams, and I told them that I needed a break. I asked my friend if she wanted to go with me and stay there. She looked at me and simply stared. "Ellie?" I asked, and I snapped my fingers in front of her face. She snapped out of it and said, Oh, sure." I now feel that Ellie saw something that night. Those people got closer to her than they did to me, and I know that it somehow affected her in some way. I've tried talking to her about it many times, but she never speaks a word about it. I figured that this trip would give her closure, help her forget about the exam stress too. Anyway, my parents drove us down there and left us to unpack. The cabin had recently been modernized with lots of high tech, because my dad had decided that he was going to make it into a true holiday home. They got us comfortable beds, extended the house and put in an indoor pool, and much, much more. We chilled out in the pool all day. We were only there for a weekend, so we needed to make the most of it. After locking up and falling asleep, we were woken up around 10 p.m. I woke up first, and Ellie woke up about 10 minutes later. We watched movies until exactly 1:50 a.m., when Ellie suggested that we go down to the lake. I said no and reminded her of what had happened last time. "Please," she pleaded, "just for a while." I knew that I couldn't resist. We got to the water, and I threw in my dad's kayak. I knew that if anything was to happen, we would be able to boat away. We got into the lake, and I pulled the kayak in further. It got a little tiring, so I suggested that I stay in the kayak for a minute or two and rest. Ellie agreed. It was around 30 minutes later when I woke up to the sound of rippling. It hurt my head, I realized. We had fallen asleep on the kayak. I woke up in a daze, hitting Ellie with the paddle accidentally. She awoke and told me to bog off, and asked me, "What was that for?" lightly rubbing the spot on her head that I had hit with the paddle. I looked around and I felt my stomach plummet. I could taste the fear in the back of my throat. I sat there, retching with anxiety. They were here, and there were twice as many as before. They completely surrounded the lake. There was no way to get out. Ellie stared at them. "Ellie," I said. She didn't respond. "Ellie?" I said again and again, no reaction. Then she turned to look at me and then jumped into the water. I began breathing heavily as she pulled me and the kayak towards the shore, towards them. "Ellie, what are you doing? Stop it, please!" I screamed. I still got no answer. We kept going until we reached them. I closed my eyes and started crying. I saw the rest of the group coming towards us, swimming through the lake. Ellie lifted my head up and told me to check the survival box in the kayak for a torch. I pulled out a box of matches and I gave them to her. The people stood 4 feet away from us. She looked at me and then said, "They're not what you think they are." With that, she struck the match on the side of the box. She held it up to the person nearest us, so that it exposed their face, and memories began flooding in. When me and Ellie were freshmen, 120 seniors on a school trip went scuba diving. They all drowned about a mile away from the lake we were in at the time. They were getting ready to leave when an oil tank burst and caused a blockage in their oxygen tanks. All of them died except for a few. I recognized the guy that Ellie showed me. He was one of the victims from the oil leak. They all were. He looked at me. His face looked normal. His skin was peachy. They were all dressed in black morph suits. They all cleared a pathway and began chanting, "Run, run, 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 run." I began running and got halfway back to the lake house before I realized that Ellie wasn't behind me. I looked back and I saw her in the lake, her head underwater, bubbles rising. I ran and ran and ran. I could taste the metallic taste of blood. I had been biting my lip hard the entire time. I got to the lake house and I called 911. They said that they couldn't come to the house if there was no danger to me or anyone else. I called my mom and I told her to come and get me. Within 2 hours, she got there and I ran to the car. I grabbed my phone, the house keys, and my wallet before running to the car. "Drive!" I screeched as I jumped in. She pressed down on the gas pedal and I noticed that they were still all there. The sun hadn't risen yet and those people were still in the water with Ellie. "She's dead," I said. "Who?" my mom replied. "Ellie, they killed her." "Sweetie, don't you remember we talked about this? I understand that Ellie's death was a shock, but it's been 2 years now," she said. I sat there and I felt my body shake. I had flashbacks to the day. I had flashbacks to that day. The first time that I saw those people, when I snuck out of the house with Ellie. I began to cry, remembering suddenly how Ellie drowned that day. But it was okay. I still had my other friends. Joseph, Kate, Dylan, and Ellie. Oh, that reminds me. I need to ask Ellie if she wants to come to the lake house next weekend. I like Ellie. She gets ignored a lot, but at least I have Ellie to get me through the death of Ellie. Do I need to get you to see a therapist again? Is your schizo getting worse, honey? My mom asked me. Nope, it's fine, Mom. Just fine. Old Town in the Mountains, written by Cutie Kathy, 54. One of my patients had a severe case of depression. I'm a therapist, by the way. Sometimes my patients request that I record audio of what they say happened to them, so that they won't have to be questioned about it over and over again. I work in a small city in Canada. I've seen many horrible cases of assault and trauma, but this one really stuck out to me. Miss Kylie Smith, age 27, unmarried, suffers from high levels of depression and schizophrenia, still under the guardianship of her father. Another thing to note is that she has her mouth cut from ear to ear, forming a scar and making it difficult to do some basic tasks. Thankfully, she's been recovering well physically. Unfortunately, not the same can be said about her mental condition. I asked her how it happened to her, what gave her this scar, and how the monsters that follow her are connected to it. The following is what she told me. My sister, Mariah, and I went on a hiking trip a few months ago. A beautiful place, lovely service, and wonderful people. However, in this area of the country, the high mountains, there isn't much development other than small towns and cities. And even in those, it's somewhat hard to keep security up. Not to mention how eerie and unsettling it is on the roads at night with no streetlights and the only light being from the moon, stars, and the occasional passing car. And if you're lucky, a flashlight or a phone. Plus, you have to watch your step or you'll fall into a river or a lake. It's not pitch black, but it's dark enough to need a flashlight. Walk slowly and watch your step if you don't have one. I don't know why my sister and I decided to risk our lives just to see a few cool sights. Maybe it's the thrill of adventure. Or maybe it's just what kids do when they're bored. Also, just saying, my sister was a beautiful person. Silky short strawberry hair, tanned skin, and a curvy yet slim figure, beautiful emerald eyes, healthy pink lips. Now, me on the other hand, well. Anyways, me and her got to our hotel room at around 10 p.m. The town is pretty well populated, but our hotel was around 2 or 3 miles away from the marketplace. And again, there were eerie, dark roads with no streetlights at all. Just the distant marketplace, lighting up the horizon. We both had our phones with us. It was a miracle that we hadn't dropped them yet and that they weren't even scratched. I left mine in the room though. The area was known to be relatively crime-free, so it was pretty safe to walk around alone. But I should have just stuck with my phone addiction and taken it anyway. Mariah though, she took hers. I mean, we needed some sort of light to help us walk. What are we, bats? We need to see so that we don't get mugged too easy or fall into some fast-flowing river. She decided to walk behind me with the light facing forward. One in the front to lead and one in the back to light, which seemed fair. At least I guess so. We walked for a few minutes, chatting as we do, joking about how scary the road is, and that if we dropped something, especially as valuable as her phone, it would probably be gone for good. Just then I heard something fall and Mariah swear. I looked at her. I noticed that there was a light on a rock just off the road. Of course, her phone had fallen down near the river. Thank God that the way down wasn't that steep. Nor long, it was just a few feet. She said, "Go on ahead, watch your step, I'll go grab my phone." I nodded and replied K, walking carefully to the market. I walked for about a minute or two, maybe longer, maybe less. It felt boring without someone to keep me company, even if it was just for a few minutes. Time slowed down, but I didn't. I then stopped and turned around to look and see if Mariah was there. There was no sign of her, and I got worried as I heard a splash in the river. That's where it all started. 1,000 horrible thoughts filled my mind. My instincts kicked in. I sprinted and ran. I flew to where she had stopped. I was swearing and holding back tears as I did. I immediately looked down, calling her name, in a weak, shaky voice, trying to keep myself together. Then I saw it, the light of her phone. I sighed with relief as she signaled me to keep on going. The light was only illuminating her lower half, her denim jeans, a bit of her black hoodie, and a bit of her almost completely covered arm. It was cold, what can I say? I kept on walking. I asked, "Are you good?" And she gave me a thumbs up in reply. "Okay," I said, and I kept on walking. That splash must have given her a scare, whatever it was. She wasn't talking much, not at all, just showing signs with her hands. I couldn't really see her face or any of her upper half in general. I turned around again to ask her why she wasn't talking, and that's when I saw it. Her hand, which she was covering up trying to keep it in her pocket. Her beautiful tan skin was now white, and by that I mean pale. Her gorgeous hand, one that had just minutes ago looked like a model's, was now scrawny and skinny. I froze and gulped, but then instinct kicked in and I started shaking in fear. We were almost to the market as my heart started to race. Only two thoughts came into my head. The first was, this isn't Mariah, and the second was, run. And I did just that. I ran, in tears, into the crowded market. An elderly man saw me in distress and walked over to me. "Hello, is something wrong? You seem distressed," he said. I stuttered, trying to talk, but nothing came out but whimpers as I pointed at the road. The man's eyes went to look at her. He yelled something in their native language, which I couldn't understand. For some reason, he still had that smile on his face. At that moment, I didn't even care. As I looked up to see the light of the market shine on my sister, she walked towards me. Her face, no, its face. That face. A cliché monster, and the same one that follows me. It was grinning ear to ear with white eyes, dripping with blood. It had very little hair, so little that you would think that it was bald. Its hair was short and greasy. It was a hairstyle like my sister's, but nothing like her shiny, silky hair. I heard gunshots and screeches. I couldn't tell if it was shot or not, but its voice haunts me, and it will forever. A scream that belongs in hell. It sounded like the devil himself got scared and screeched in either fear or pain. And there was the thing's grin. I didn't even realize I had started hyperventilating as I felt as if I was going to faint. Some of the locals grabbed me and pulled me into a little house. They tried to calm me down. They themselves seemed oddly calm, as if this was all a perfectly normal thing, or maybe even a good thing. But they were just trying to distract me, right? I kept losing it, sobbing, yelling, in fear and sadness and anger and in disgust. I had so many emotions now that I just couldn't manage it, and I eventually blacked out. I woke up to the sound of what sounded like chanting. I felt a pain in my mouth. I opened my eyes to see more of those monsters, and the locals feasting on the corpse of my sister as they carved into the side of my mouth. It's there, looking at me now through the window, right now, tapping on the glass. Don't you hear it? That's what she told me during our last session. And that last line, it gives me chills to this day. I remember a distinct light tapping on the window right before she said it. Sometimes I wonder if my patients are really mentally ill, or if it's just something that we can't see.